For a long-haul trucker, a rest stop is more than just a place to park. It's a sanctuary. After hundreds of miles of hypnotic asphalt and crushing solitude, the glow of a rest area sign on the horizon is a promise of safety, coffee, and a few precious hours of sleep. It's a temporary community of fellow road warriors, a brightly lit island in a vast sea of darkness. But these places are also deeply transient. They are crossroads of anonymity, where countless strangers pass through, each carrying their own secrets. The sense of safety can be a fragile illusion. The thin wall of a sleeper cab is the only thing separating a driver from the vast, unpredictable world outside. And sometimes, that world is filled with a darkness that doesn't stay on the highway. Sometimes, it follows you into the parking lot. Today, we pull off the interstate and into the unsettling twilight of the American rest stop. These are the true, first-hand accounts of truckers who parked their rigs for a moment of peace, only to find themselves trapped in a real-life nightmare. These stories come from the places meant for rest, but where sleep is the last thing you'll find. Story 1. The Tapping Man. Our first story comes from a driver named Gary, a man who spent the better part of his life hauling produce up and down the I-5 corridor, from the fields of California to the markets of the Pacific Northwest. By 2011, Gary was a veteran of the road, a creature of habit with a healthy dose of professional cynicism. He'd seen his share of strange things, but he was a practical man who believed in what he could see and touch. He wasn't prone to flights of fancy or paranoia. His world was one of diesel, deadlines, and the comforting weight of 18 wheels on solid ground. This pragmatism, however, offered him no defense against what happened one foggy night at a remote, notoriously grim rest stop in the mountains of southern Oregon. The Siskiyou Pass is a beautiful but treacherous stretch of highway. In the dead of winter, it's a battle against snow and ice. On this particular night in late autumn, it was a battle against a fog so thick it felt like driving through milk. Visibility was down to a few feet, and the winding mountain roads were slick with moisture. Gary was exhausted, his eyes burning from the strain of peering into the oppressive gray. Pushing on was not just foolish, it was suicidal. He saw the sign for the Siskiyou Summit Rest Area and gratefully pulled in, navigating his rig into a spot at the far end of the truck parking lot, away from the hum of the other idling engines. He wanted absolute quiet. It was a decision he would come to regret for the rest of his life. This particular rest stop had a reputation. It was old, poorly lit, and known as a magnet for transients and other unsavory characters. But Gary had parked here 100 times before without incident. He figured the thick fog would keep most people away. After a quick walk to stretch his legs and a brief call to his wife, he climbed into his sleeper cab, locked the doors, drew the thick curtain that separated the cab from the sleeper, and settled in for a few hours of much-needed rest. The fog outside was so dense it seemed to muffle all sound, creating an eerie, almost complete silence. He was drifting in that hazy space between wakefulness and sleep when he first heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the passenger side of his cab. Gary's eyes snapped open. His first thought was that it was a tree branch, blown by the wind. But there was no wind. The air was unnaturally still. He lay there, listening. Tap, tap, tap. It was a deliberate sound. Measured. Patient. It sounded like a fingernail, or perhaps a small stone being tapped gently against the passenger side window. A cold knot of annoyance and suspicion formed in his stomach. It was probably a lot lizard, a truck stop prostitute, or a beggar. He'd dealt with them before. The standard procedure was to ignore them. Don't engage, don't make a sound, and eventually they move on. He closed his eyes, trying to will the sound away. Tap, tap, tap. The sound didn't stop. It continued with the same maddening metronomic rhythm. It wasn't aggressive, not yet. It was just persistent. Gary lay there for what felt like an eternity, his annoyance slowly curdling into genuine unease. The silence between the taps seemed to stretch, filled with a heavy, expectant tension. Why wasn't this person giving up? After about 20 minutes of the relentless tapping, Gary had had enough. He was tired, on edge, and his patience was gone. He decided to break his own rule. He would scare them off. He quietly swung his legs out of the bunk, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He crept to the curtain and, in one swift motion, yanked it back, ready to yell at whoever was out there. There was no one there. The passenger seat was empty. The window was clear, beaded with condensation from the fog. He scanned the area visible through the windshield and side windows. Nothing. Just the swirling gray mist and the faint, distant glow of the rest stop's main building. The tapping had stopped the instant he moved. A shiver traced its way down his spine. He told himself the person must have seen his movement and run off. He sat there for a long moment, listening to the sound of his own breathing before convincing himself it was over. He drew the curtain, climbed back into his bunk, and tried to settle his nerves. But sleep was now impossible. He was wide awake, every sense on high alert. For about half an hour, there was only silence. He was just starting to relax, just starting to think he had imagined the whole thing, when the sound returned. This time it was different. Scra-up, tap, scra-ape. It was coming from the roof of his cab. It was a slow, dragging sound, like someone was pulling themselves across the metal surface, and it was punctuated by that same deliberate tap. A cold, primal fear, unlike anything he had ever felt, seized him. This was not a prostitute, this was not a beggar. Someone was on top of his truck. He lay there, paralyzed, every muscle in his body screaming at him to move, to do something, but he was frozen by sheer terror. The scraping sound moved slowly from the passenger side of the roof to directly above his head. He could hear the faint groan of the metal under a shifting weight. He was trapped. The sleeper cab, his sanctuary, had become a coffin. He was lying in a sealed metal box, and something was on top of it, trying to get in. He thought about his options. He could start the engine and hit the air horn. That would surely attract attention. But the thought of the ignition sequence, the roar of the engine, felt like it would be an act of aggression, a challenge to whatever was on his roof. He had the terrifying, irrational thought that making a loud noise would provoke it. He could call 911, but what would he say? "There's a strange noise on my roof?" He would sound like a lunatic. The scraping stopped. It was now directly above the sleeper's emergency hatch, a small bolted-down exit on the roof. And then, the tapping began again. But it wasn't the gentle tap of a fingernail anymore. Bang, bang, bang. It was the sound of a fist, or something harder, pounding on the emergency hatch. The entire cab vibrated with the force of the blows. This was no longer patient. This was violent. This was a determined attempt to break through. Gary scrambled out of the bunk, his back pressed against the far wall of the sleeper, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He could see the hatch, a small square of plastic and metal, visibly flexing inward with each deafening blow. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy with terror. He dialed 911, his voice a choked whisper as he tried to explain the situation. "I'm a trucker at the Siskiyou Summit Rest Area. Someone is on my truck. They're trying to get in." As he was on the phone, the pounding stopped. A new sound began, a sound that was somehow even more terrifying. A high-pitched, metallic screeching. It was the sound of metal on metal. The sound of a tool, a crowbar or a screwdriver, being forced into the seam of the emergency hatch, trying to pry it open. "They're prying the hatch open," he screamed into the phone. The dispatcher's voice was a calm, distant drone, trying to get his exact location, his truck number, but all Gary could focus on was the screeching metal just a few feet above his head. He grabbed the heaviest thing he could find, a hefty fire extinguisher. He stood on the bunk, holding the extinguisher like a club, his eyes glued to the hatch. He could see the bolts straining, the metal groaning in protest. A small gap appeared, and a sliver of the foggy, grey night was visible. And then, a finger. A long, pale, impossibly thin finger, wriggling its way into the gap, followed by another and another. Just as the hand began to force its way into the cab, the night was split open by the piercing wail of a siren. It was approaching fast. The screeching from the roof stopped instantly. The fingers withdrew. Gary heard a soft thud as something landed on the ground outside his truck, followed by the sound of running footsteps, fading quickly into the fog. A state trooper's car pulled up beside his rig, its flashing lights painting the cab in strobing blues and reds. The officer, a young, serious-looking man, approached the cab with his hand on his weapon. Gary, trembling and drenched in sweat, stumbled out of the truck, babbling his story. The trooper listened patiently, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog as he inspected the rig. And then he found the proof. On the roof, there were deep, fresh scratches in the paint, leading from the passenger side to the emergency hatch. The hatch itself was bent and mangled, the bolts nearly torn from their housing. And on the ground below, in the soft, damp dirt, were footprints. They were barefoot, long, narrow, barefoot prints, leading away from the truck and disappearing into the woods that bordered the rest stop. They never found who it was. The other truckers in the lot hadn't seen or heard a thing, insulated by their own running engines in the thick, sound-dampening fog. There were no other reports, no other incidents. It was a ghost in the mist, a phantom that had singled out Gary for reasons he would never know. Gary sold his rig a month later. He couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't sleep in the cab. Every tap, every creak, every scrape of a branch sent him into a cold panic. The feeling of being trapped in that metal box, with that thing on the roof trying to get in, had broken something deep inside him. He took a local dispatch job, forever chained to a desk, a prisoner of the memory of that night. He is still haunted by the image of those long, pale fingers wriggling through the gap in his roof, and by the terrifying, unanswered question, what would have happened if the police had been 30 seconds later? Story 2. The Man with No Face. The vast, sun-scorched deserts of the American Southwest are a world unto themselves. They are landscapes of profound beauty and brutal indifference. For truckers, crossing these stretches is an exercise in endurance. The heat is relentless, the distances are vast, and the isolation is absolute. Our second story comes from this world, from a driver named Ray, and it took place at a tiny, forgotten rest stop in the middle of the Arizona desert in the summer of 2005. It's a story about a heat-shimmering mirage that turned out to be terrifyingly real. Ray was hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Los Angeles, a route he knew like the back of his hand. It was the height of summer, and the afternoon sun was a physical weight, beating down on the asphalt and radiating a heat that made the air itself seem to vibrate. His air conditioner was fighting a losing battle, and he was feeling the dull, creeping fatigue that comes from driving in extreme heat. He knew he needed to pull over, rehydrate, and get out of the sun for a bit before he made a dangerous mistake. He saw a sign for a rest area a few miles ahead. It wasn't one of the big modern ones. This was an old state-run stop, little more than a paved parking lot, a small sun-bleached brick building with restrooms and a few covered picnic tables. It was the kind of place most drivers passed by, but for Ray, it was an oasis. He pulled his rig into the nearly empty truck parking area. There was only one other truck there, an old rust bucket of a flatbed parked at the far end. As he was shutting down his engine, he noticed a man standing by one of the picnic tables. The man was just standing there, staring out at the desert. This struck Ray as odd. It was well over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. No sane person would be standing out in the direct sun. They'd be in their air-conditioned cab or inside the restroom building, where it was at least marginally cooler. Ray shrugged it off. The desert attracted strange people. He grabbed his water bottle and climbed out of his cab, the heat hitting him like a physical blow. He started walking towards the restroom building, and as he did, he got a better look at the man. He was tall and lanky, dressed in heavy, dark clothing, a thick flannel shirt and dark jeans. It was absurdly inappropriate for the weather, but the most unsettling thing was his face. From this distance, about 100 feet, Ray couldn't make out any features. It wasn't that they were blurry. It was that they didn't seem to be there at all. His face looked like a smooth, pale, featureless oval. Ray blinked, rubbing his eyes. It had to be a trick of the light, the heat haze distorting his vision. He told himself it was a mirage, a product of his own fatigue and the shimmering heat waves rising from the asphalt. He looked away, unnerved, and hurried into the restroom building. The cool, dim interior was a relief. He splashed cold water on his face and refilled his bottle. He stayed inside for about 10 minutes, letting his body temperature come down, the image of the featureless man nagging at the back of his mind. When he walked back out, he immediately looked towards the picnic table. The man was gone. Ray felt a wave of relief. It had just been a mirage, a heat-induced hallucination. He chuckled at his own foolishness and started walking back toward his truck. As he passed the other rig, the old, rusty flatbed, he glanced at it out of habit. The cab was empty. The flatbed was loaded with what looked like large, irregularly shaped pieces of scrap metal covered loosely by a dirty, tattered tarp. He was about to climb back into his own truck when he saw him again, the man in the flannel shirt. He was now standing on the other side of the parking lot, near the on-ramp back to the interstate, and he was staring directly at Ray. This time he was closer, maybe 50 feet away, and the terrible, impossible truth was undeniable. The man had no face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. His head was a perfectly smooth, pale, egg-like oval, like a mannequin head that had been sanded down. There was no hair, no ears, nothing, just a blank, featureless surface. Ray froze, his hand on the door handle of his truck. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. It was impossible. It had to be a mask, a very strange, very realistic mask. But why? Why would someone wear a mask like that in this heat, in the middle of nowhere? The faceless man took a step towards him. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Then another. He began to walk across the scorching asphalt, directly towards Ray. His gait was strange, a stiff, almost jerky motion, like a puppet being controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. He didn't seem to be affected by the blistering heat at all. A primal, instinctual terror gripped Ray. This was not a person. This was something else. Something deeply, fundamentally wrong. He ripped his truck door open, scrambled inside, and fumbled with the ignition. The engine roared to life. He didn't bother with pre-trip checks. He just needed to get away. He slammed the truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator, his rig lurching forward. As he pulled out of the parking spot, he looked in his side mirror. The faceless man was still coming, his pace unchanged, a slow, relentless march. He was now in the middle of the parking lot, a dark, impossible figure shimmering in the heat. Ray careened out of the rest stop and onto the on-ramp, merging recklessly into traffic. He pushed his rig as fast as it would go, his eyes glued to his mirrors. For a few terrifying moments, he could still see the man, a small, dark figure standing on the shoulder of the highway, seemingly watching him go. Then, the figure was gone. Ray drove for 2 hours straight without slowing down, his heart pounding the entire time. He didn't stop until he reached the outskirts of a larger town, pulling into a busy, brightly lit truck stop filled with other drivers. He felt safer there, surrounded by people, the comforting noise of a dozen idling engines a balm for his frayed nerves. He sat in his cab for a long time, trying to make sense of what he had seen. A mask? A hallucination? He had been tired. The heat had been extreme. It was possible his mind had played a trick on him. He desperately wanted to believe that. He decided to get on the CB, hoping the sound of other human voices would ground him. He switched to channel 19. The usual chatter was there, but as he listened, he caught a conversation between two other drivers that made his blood run cold. "Yeah, you know the one," a driver was saying. "That little ghost stop about 100 miles east of Kingman, the one with the flatbed." "Heard stories about that place," another voice replied. "Never stopped there myself. They say it ain't safe." "Ain't safe is the understatement of the year," the first driver said. Old man Hemlock used to tell a story about it. Said he pulled in there one night, saw this old rusty flatbed parked in the corner. Said a guy came out of it, a guy with no face. Just a blank. Said the thing came after him. Hemlock swore it wasn't human. Ray's hands went numb. He grabbed his mic, his voice trembling. "Big Red, what's your 20? I need to talk to the driver talking about the ghost stop." The first driver responded, his voice wary. "Who's asking?" I was just there," Ray stammered. "I saw him." The man with no face. There was a long, heavy silence on the channel. Then the first driver's voice came back, low and serious. "Son, you need to listen to me. You got lucky. The story goes that the thing that drives that flatbed, it collects people. Drifters, hitchhikers, people no one will miss. That scrap metal on the back of his truck? That ain't scrap metal. Hemlock said he got a look under the tarp once, said it was bodies, twisted and broken like they'd been compacted." Ray felt the bile rise in his throat. He thought of the irregularly shaped scrap metal under the tarp on the old flatbed. "You get out of that area, driver," the voice on the radio continued, "and you never, ever stop at that rest area again. Some places on this road, they belong to things other than us, and that place belongs to him." Ray shut off the CB. He didn't sleep that night. He drove straight through to Los Angeles, fueled by coffee and pure terror. He never took that route through Arizona again. He requested a transfer to a northern route, putting 1,000 miles of road between him and that sun-scorched patch of hell. He never knew what he saw that day. A man in a mask playing a sick game. A heat-induced hallucination shared by multiple drivers over many years. Or was it something else? A desert spirit, a demon, a collector of lost souls that haunts the lonely places of the world. He only knows that it was real, that it was walking towards him, and that he is one of the few who ever drove away from the man with no face. Story 3. The Children of the Corn. The American Midwest, with its vast, endless fields of corn, has a unique, haunting beauty. In the daytime, it's the heartland, a picture of pastoral peace. But at night, it transforms. The cornfields become towering, impenetrable walls of darkness. The wind rustling through the dry stalks can sound like whispers, and the long, straight roads can feel like a journey to nowhere. Our final story comes from this world, from a trucker named Sam, and it concerns a late-night stop at a small, isolated rest area in rural Iowa, surrounded on all sides by an ocean of corn. Sam was hauling a load of farm equipment from Ohio to Nebraska in the late autumn of 2012. It was harvest season, and the corn stood tall and golden, ready to be taken. He'd been driving for 10 hours straight and was feeling the familiar pull of fatigue. He saw a sign for a small county-run rest area and decided to pull in for a quick nap. It was a simple place, a gravel lot, a single restroom building, and a few picnic tables, and corn. The parking lot was carved directly out of a massive cornfield, the tall stalks pressing in on all sides, creating a feeling of intense, claustrophobic isolation. It was just after midnight when he pulled in. The lot was completely empty. He was the only one there. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the corn. Sam felt a little on edge. The isolation was more profound than he was used to, but he was too tired to care. He locked his doors, drew his curtains, and was asleep within minutes. He was jolted awake by a sound. It was laughter, children's laughter. He sat up, his heart pounding. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard. It was 2:30 a.m. He strained his ears, listening. There it was again, faint but clear. The sound of several children laughing and giggling. It seemed to be coming from just outside his truck. Sam was bewildered. What would children be doing at a remote rest stop in the middle of the night? It made no sense. He cautiously peeked through a small gap in his curtain. The parking lot was still empty, bathed in the cold, sterile light of a single sodium lamp. He couldn't see anyone, but the laughter continued, a joyful, innocent sound that was made terrifying by the time and place. He told himself it was the wind playing tricks, carrying the sound from a distant farmhouse. But the sound was too close, too distinct, and it was moving. He could hear it circling his rig, sometimes fading as it moved to the far side, then growing louder as it came back around. It was accompanied by the faint sound of running footsteps on the gravel. A deep, primal unease began to settle over him. He was alone, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by an impenetrable wall of corn, and a group of unseen children were running circles around his truck in the dead of night. He reached for his phone to call the police, but then he hesitated. What would he say? I hear children laughing outside my truck. They would think he was drunk or crazy. He decided to wait, to see if they would just go away. The laughter stopped. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind in the corn. Sam held his breath, praying it was over. Then a new sound started. A soft, rhythmic thudding against the side of his trailer. Thud, thud, thud. It sounded like small hands, slapping against the metal. He peeked through the curtain again. He still couldn't see anyone, but the sound was undeniable. It moved along the length of his trailer, from the back toward the cab. It was as if they were playing a game, running along the side of his truck and hitting it as they passed. The thudding stopped at his cab. A moment of silence. Then a small, pale face appeared in his passenger side window. Sam recoiled, a strangled cry escaping his lips. It was a young boy, no older than 10, with straw-colored hair and eyes that were too large and dark for his face. He was just staring in. His expression was completely blank, devoid of any emotion. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't laughing. He was just watching. Before Sam could react, another face appeared next to the boy's. A young girl with long, dark hair and the same empty, soulless eyes. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire passenger side window was filled with the pale, blank faces of children, their small hands pressed against the glass, their dead eyes fixed on him. Sam scrambled away from the window, his back hitting the driver's side door. He was hyperventilating, his mind screaming. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. They looked like something out of a nightmare, their faces unnaturally pale in the gloom, their eyes like black pits. Then they all began to speak in unison. It was not the joyful sound of laughter. It was a soft, melodic, chanting whisper. The words were indistinct, a strange, lilting language he didn't recognize, but the tone was hypnotic, mesmerizing. It filled the cab, a chorus of ghostly voices that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. He had to get out. He had to drive. He lunged for the ignition, his hand shaking violently. As his fingers closed around the key, the chanting stopped. All the faces disappeared from the window at once. The silence that rushed in was deafening. Sam didn't wait. He turned the key, the engine roaring to life with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the stillness. He threw the truck in gear and stomped on the gas, not even caring where he was going, just needing to move. His headlights cut a swath through the darkness, and in that brief, terrifying moment, he saw them. They were standing in a line at the edge of the parking lot, just before the cornfield. There were about a dozen of them, children of all ages, all dressed in simple, old-fashioned clothing. They stood perfectly still, side by side, their pale faces turned towards him, their dark eyes following his every move. They weren't children. They were sentinels, guardians of the corn. As his truck hurtled out of the rest stop and back onto the empty highway, Sam looked in his rearview mirror. The children hadn't moved. They just stood there, a silent, terrifying tableau, watching him until their small forms were swallowed by the darkness. Sam drove until sunrise, his mind a chaotic mess of terror and disbelief. He pulled into a busy, brightly lit truck stop and called his dispatcher, telling him he was sick and couldn't finish the run. He couldn't get the image of those blank faces, those dead eyes, out of his head. A few weeks later, after he had quit his job and sworn off driving through Iowa ever again, he was telling the story to another ex-trucker in a bar. The other man listened patiently, his face growing pale. When Sam was finished, the man took a long drink of his beer. "You got lucky," the man said, his voice low. "There are stories about that part of the state. Old stories. About a settlement that was there, back in the 1800s. A whole town that just vanished. The official story is they moved on, but the local legends say something different." "What do they say?" Sam asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They say the town made a pact," the man continued, his eyes dark. "A pact with something that lived in the corn. Something old and hungry. They say they sacrificed their own children to it to ensure a good harvest. But the children didn't stay dead. They became the guardians of the field, the children of the corn. They say they still watch over that land, and sometimes, when a lone traveler stops for the night, they come out to play. They try to lure you out of your car, out of your truck. They want you to come and join them, to come and play in the corn. Forever." Sam left the bar that night and never spoke of the incident again. But he never forgot. He never forgot the sound of their laughter, the sight of their pale, blank faces pressed against his window, or the hypnotic, ghostly chant that had almost lured him out into the dark. He had stopped for a moment of rest and had stumbled into a living nightmare, a terrifying piece of folklore that was all too real. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his soul, that the children were still out there, waiting in the rustling darkness, watching the road and waiting for the next lonely traveler to stop and play their game.